I am at the Sprouting Hope Community Garden today, getting ready to do some planting. So I want to give you some tips on how to get your garden started this year. So we'll talk about how to use your tools. We'll talk about planting, both sowing and transplanting. We'll talk about thinning, watering, hoeing, and then we'll talk about mulching. So let's get into it. So I want to start by talking about ergonomics, the way that you use your body while you're gardening. Because gardening is a very physical activity, and obviously if you're hurting afterwards, it's not going to be nearly as enjoyable. So it is very physical, so while you're getting started, you might feel some stiffness or soreness, but if you're really in pain, something is wrong, so try doing the task in a different way or ask me for advice. So most of the ways you'll take care of your body while you're gardening is the same for any type of physical activity. So if you're going to be doing any heavy duty work like digging, make sure that you warm up ahead of time and consider stretching before and after. If you are carrying a heavy bucket, instead of carrying it on one side, split it between two buckets and carry one in each hand. If you're struggling with a full watering can, just fill it up twice and take trips, because you don't want to end up dumping it all on one plant just to try and get it to be a little lighter. So one thing to keep in mind is that a tool like a shovel works like a lever. So if you've got the shovel all loaded up with a shovel full of soil, the further you hold it away from your body, the heavier it's going to be. So if you can help it, try and hold a hand much closer to the load and it'll be a lot easier. In the same vein, your body also works as a lever. So your upper body has a lot of weight to it. So when you lean over, all of that weight gets put on your lower back. So you want to make sure that you don't give too much weight just straight to your lower back. Like if you're leaning, if you're pulling something up, keep that in mind. And try to also limit any twisting that you do, especially twisting while reaching, because then you have to use some weaker muscles. So another way that you can take weight off of your lower back if you do need to bend over is of course to bend your knees, because that'll put some of that weight on your legs instead of just your back. So that's why when you're lifting, you always want to bend your knees and keep your back straight and lift this way instead of this way. Because even if it's something that you can do, like, you know, let's say we've got a shovel full of soil, we're going to use locked knees and a rounded back, and we're going to hold it back here. Even if it's something that you can do, if you're going to be repeating the process a bunch of times, it's a lot easier to do it properly and just make things easier on yourself. Like, you know, maybe you can throw a shovel full of dirt, but again, if you're repeating it, just walk it over and let it slide off. It's going to save you a lot of energy over the course of the day. So remember to switch positions a lot. If I have to bend over for a long time, I'll switch it up pretty often. So if I'm bending at the waist, it's much easier to keep your feet apart and your knees bent, because again, that takes weight off of your lower back, and it also helps you get easier, closer to the ground easier. Another thing you can do is crouch. Only if this works for you to do a deep crouch comfortably, it can be a pretty good way to go. If you're going to kneel on both knees, make sure that you're not leaning out too far, because this can get difficult to balance. So usually what I end up doing the most is kneeling on one knee. So this way I can rest comfortably, but I'm also mobile enough that I can move down the row. So if you're going to be doing this, make sure that you switch knees pretty often. You also want to make sure that when you're working on the ground, since you are going to be leaning over, make sure you keep your shoulders relaxed and your head in line to try and help prevent a stiff neck. And if you do start feeling stiff, take a break and stretch. But in general, using long-handled tools is more ergonomic. It's better for your body. So, you know, using a hoe is going to be easier on your body than pulling weeds by hand. Using a rake is going to be easier than using this small cultivator. So try and do as much work as you can with these long-handled tools before you get down into the ground. And if there's a particular tool that just really feels like it's taking it out of you, it's possible that it could be the wrong size. This is more likely if you're particularly short or tall. So if you find yourself having that problem, let me know and we can try and find a different length handle or a different tag rope handle. Overall though, just generally do what feels comfortable for you. If it doesn't feel comfortable, take a break, listen to your body, and ask me for advice if you're having any problems. Also, for basic safety, if you're just going out to harvest a little bit or water, go ahead and wear whatever you want, but if you're going to be using tools, always wear closed-toed shoes, and I strongly recommend wearing long pants. It will be much more comfortable if you're kneeling, you won't scrape yourself, and there's less chance of having an accident with your tools. You might also want to wear some lightweight long sleeves for sun protection, or if you're working with scratchy stuff like okra. Okay, so these bow rakes are pretty straightforward. These are more heavy duty than leaf rakes, so you can dig down into the soil and pull things like rocks or weeds. You can also just hold it lightly if you want to skim along the surface. And one thing that I do a lot is to flip it over and use the back to smooth out the soil. And if you want, you can also use the front side of the rake to tamp down a row of seeds that you just planted like that. A pointed shovel is good for digging. You can get down a lot deeper than a square shovel. So this is what you'll want to use for making a bigger hole, like for planting your tomatoes. You can also use it for chopping, like if you've got a lot of thick broccoli stems that you want to chop into your compost pile. And there's also a really cool trick for weeding with a shovel. Like if you've got a lot of really tall weeds or maybe a cover crop and it's too much to hoe. So if you want to clear the surface of your soil, you can skim along like this. So you stand with your front knee bent. You'll hold pretty close to the front and then the back. Your front hand will guide it and your back hand will give the power. And so then you just skim right along the top of the soil like this. So the square shovel is much better for scooping. There's a little bit of extra area on the corners compared to the round shovel, and the raised sides make it a good option for moving soil or compost or wood chips. And I will show you how you can also use it to make raised beds. So these forks are my favorite digging tool for a couple reasons. You use it just like a shovel, but it's much better than a shovel for digging something up rather than just digging soil. Like if you're digging potatoes or carrots or you're trying to get a rock up, that sort of thing. Because the soil sifts through the tines and it will leave larger objects. So here's how you can turn your soil over with a fork. You push it in like a shovel. You lift the soil out, bending your knees back straight, and then you drop it and then just sort of smack the aggregates left and right until they're smooth. And when you're doing this, work methodically, working your way down the bed, and then you rake it. And this is the best way to work up your soil by hand if you're not going to till it, but you need to soften it up. The chopping hoe is good for sliding across small weeds or chopping into bigger weeds. And you can also use it to open up a furrow for planting, which is like a little ditch. So this hoe works well for deeper furrows, like for potatoes. You can open up quite a deep furrow if you use it that way. But for shallow furrows, I usually just end up using the handle of whatever tool I'm using. Usually it ends up being the back of a rake just because it saves having to switch tools if I'm already using one. But definitely use a hoe for deeper furrows. For a stirrup hoe, you'll use a back and forth rocking motion. You can get some pretty good power from this, and you can get cutting action from both directions, forward and back. This is a lot easier when the weeds are small, but it definitely busts through bigger weeds if you put some muscle into it. Here is the hand tool set. We've got the trowel, the transplanter, and then the cultivator claw. So the trowel has a curve to it, which makes it really good for scooping if you want to pick up soil or compost and move it around. The transplanter is much straighter and narrower, which makes it good for transplanting. You can hold it with your whole fist and pull it towards you, and it'll hold the soil out of the way while you drop your plant in. You can also just use your hands for transplanting. This is usually what I do because it's quicker, but using a transplanter is definitely more tidy. You can try it both ways and see which you prefer. And since this transplanter is pretty flat, it also makes it good for taking soil samples. And it's got nice little measurements written on it as well. So the cultivator is just a sort of scratching tool, and it's good if you're trying to loosen the soil or get rid of weeds in just one. These three tools can all be a little awkward on your wrists, so make sure that you don't try to use them in hard soil where you would have to use more force. Break up the soil, or if you're using the cultivator for weeds, then break up the weeds first with your larger tools and then go in with your hand tools. So hand pruners, these are sort of intended for shrubs and trees, but they're actually very helpful in a vegetable garden. I mainly use them for harvesting, like for zucchini, okra, winter squash, and also for trimming the roots off of things like onions after you've harvested them to clean them up. In a pinch, they also come in handy for different projects around the garden because you can use them like heavy-duty scissors, like if you need to cut some zip ties off of your trellis. But this is not the best thing that you can do if you can help it, because it will dull your blade a lot faster than if you're just cutting vegetables. Here is the harvest knife. Be careful with these, they are very sharp. I use my hand pruners for a lot of harvesting, but the knife is really good for harvesting greens like leaf lettuce or spinach. It's also good for harder to reach things like cutting the stem from underneath a cabbage. So the serration on this knife is angled, so it's meant for a pulling motion. You can saw it back and forth, but it'll really only cut on the pull, which is actually really nice for control. Alright, so you'll need to keep track of your harvest this year, and by weight is a really easy way to do it. So this is the scale that I use out at the garden, and it's the same one that all of you are going to get. So all you have to do is hang your produce on the hook, but if you're using a container that has a lot of weight to it, at least half a pound, maybe a quarter pound or so, you'll need to tare the scale first. So that means that you just hang the empty basket and you push the tare button, and then it'll automatically subtract the weight. So then you put your crop into the basket now that it reads 0, or if you take it off, it'll say a negative number, and now it should just tell you the weight of your produce. So personally, I don't usually wear gloves because I prefer to feel exactly what's going on in the soil, and I feel like I have better dexterity when I'm working with small things, but a lot of people prefer not to get quite so much dirt under their fingernails. They can also help prevent blisters, calluses, thorns. They're also definitely a good choice when you're working with scratchy plants like squash or okra. And this type of glove, you can just rinse it and then leave it out to dry, but don't leave them in the sun all the time or they could get stiff and start to crack. For tool maintenance, mostly just make sure that you get all of the dirt off of your tools after you use them. You can scrape the dirt off, brush it off, or you can rinse it with water, but make sure that your tools are dry before you put them away to prevent rust. So it's time to shape your beds and paths. I'm going to show you how to raise your beds up a little bit, and this is optional, but I definitely recommend it. It's a little easier on your back, and it can definitely benefit your plants. Shaping this bed took me about 20 minutes, so it's sped up. And this is something that we would have done together during one of your home visits, so if you want to shape your beds this way but you're not able to do it yourself, just let me know and I can come put them together. So you start by figuring out where your beds will go, and I would recommend estimating this and then marking the exact corners and lines a bit further in the process so you don't have to walk on the soil as much. And most of your gardens will work well if you orient your beds north-south, because that usually causes less issues with shading, but it'll depend on your location and your slope. And ultimately the choice is yours, but if you need help deciding, just let me know. So you will put the loose soil in your paths on top of your beds. So you take your square shovel and you shovel the paths like as if it were snow, and you throw the soil up into your beds. Since I was only doing one bed here, I put all of the soil into this bed, but when you're making a path between beds, make sure that you're putting a balanced amount of soil in each bed. And you can dig down as deep as you like, depending on how high you want to go. At least I would say 4 inches to make it worthwhile, but if you want to do 6 inches or more, go ahead. And once you've dug your rough paths, now's a good time to measure out your exact corners and to make sure that you have straight lines.
So once you have everything where you want it, to hold it in place, you'll just sort of smack the sides of the bed with the back of the shovel. Then you rake the top smooth, and then you tidy up the sides again, and you'll need to repeat this shaping process a couple of times to get it just right. So to do this, you can use the shovel at different angles, and I also used my foot to make sure that it was really compressed to hold its shape. And one thing that tends to happen during this process is that the sides will get like an angle to them, which will make your bed top narrower. So just keep that in mind and keep bringing the soil all the way out to the edges. So this is what it looks like. You can see it's not a huge lift, but it definitely does make a difference, and it can definitely help with water drainage and soil warming. And then once you're done with that, you just go ahead and finish by mulching your pads. So if you have newspaper or cardboard, you can lay that down first in your pads for the best weed suppression. That can be really helpful. And then you put down your straw or your wood chips into the pads. You'll want to do it at least 2 or 3 inches thick. You could do more if you really want to keep the weeds down, but then you'll get less of a lift. If you don't have enough mulch to do all of that, just let me know and I can bring you more. If you skipped the earlier step and you didn't raise your beds, then you just go ahead and put your straw or your wood chips straight down in the paths and just step all over it to compact it down. So those are your beds, and like I said, if this won't be possible for you to do the raised beds, I can come and do it, just ask.
The thing about tilling that's really nice is that it makes your soil super soft and smooth, but that only works for the top few inches, and it can actually make everything underneath even more compacted than it was before. So a good thing to check before you plant is that you can stick your whole fork down into the soil easily. And this will be a lot easier if you decide to raise your beds. If you get stopped by hard soil before you can get it all the way down, it'd be a good idea to loosen up some of that soil for the benefit of your plant's roots. Because in general, the bigger a plant is above ground, the deeper the roots go underground. So your biggest crops are going to be the most important to do this for, and also your root crops so they don't end up growing all crooked. Like I said in the last class, if the soil is hard to push your finger through, it will also be hard for your plant's roots to move through it. So now you're ready to plant. Some of your plants, you'll put the seeds directly in the ground, and others you'll transplant, so we're going to go over both of those. Make sure the surface of the bed is light and loose, and especially for small seeds, you want to make sure that the soil is as smooth as possible. If you did all of your bed prep a while beforehand, usually just raking the soil is enough to freshen it up. Alright, so for sowing seeds, there's a couple different ways to do it. For the crops that are listed on your crop chart as by the row foot, you'll sprinkle the seeds all the way down in a line. For the ones that are listed by the exact number of plants, you'll measure out your spacing and you'll just put the seeds right there. And so for convenience, I'll call this row foot sowing and individually sowing. So for your individually sown crops, I am giving you 3 seeds for every 1 plant that you want. So this is a little bit of overkill, but I definitely do recommend in the future that you plant at least 2 seeds for each plant that you want. In case one of them doesn't germinate, you won't have to plant again and wait again. So with your individually sown crops, you want to plant more than you need to. Just a little bit of extra because the conditions out here are not as good as in the greenhouse, so it might be too hot, too cold, too wet, too dry. Some of the seeds might be too deep or too shallow, and so not all of them are going to germinate. But if you don't get any germination, let me know so that I can get you some more seeds. Most seeds will take about a week to germinate, but some of them can take up to 2 weeks. So you'll need to plant your seeds at the correct depth in the soil. Most seed companies will tell you the exact depth on the packet, but in general, small seeds need to be planted shallower, like 1/4 of an inch. Larger seeds should be planted deeper, like 1/2 an inch or even a full inch. And super tiny seeds like lettuce should barely even be covered at all, like 1/8 of an inch. So when you cover these, instead of covering the soil back up, you can just sprinkle a layer of soil on top of them. So a seed is actually a lot like an egg. So in an egg, the yolk is the chicken, and then the egg white is just there to give it energy. And the same works for seeds. Bigger seeds have more egg white, which will give it more energy to push up to the surface. So smaller seeds in particular have a lot less energy, so you need to be really careful not to plant them too deep. But you also don't want to plant the seed too shallow because it could get uncovered and then a bird might find it, or the soil at the surface will be too dry for the seed to soften properly. Seeds have a tough outer shell called the seed coat that protects the rest of the seed inside, which is the part that will grow. The seed coat will get softened by water over the course of a few days. Once the water reaches the middle of the seed gets activated and will start to grow. So the soil needs to be steadily moist during this time, which is easier a bit deeper in the soil. You don't have to get the exact perfect depth though. Most of your seeds will still do fine if they're a little bit too deep or a little bit too shallow. But if you start to get maybe more than 1/4 of an inch off, that's when you might start to have problems with sprouting.
Peas and corn in particular are very large seeds, so it takes a long time for water to reach all the way to the middle and activate the seed. So if you soak them in water before planting, it can speed up their germination time. So just let them sit in room temperature water for a few hours or overnight up to 12 hours right before planting to help them jumpstart the water absorption process and sprouting. For row foot sowing, you start by making a furrow at your planting depth, which is basically just drawing a line where you want your row to be. So if this is the bed and I want 2 rows, I would go here and here. 3 rows would be here, here, and here. And remember that if you're doing 4 rows, you should space it out with enough room to fit a hoe in between. So if I'm going to do 2 rows today, I'll draw a line, and this is about the right depth for these beet seeds. It looks a little deeper, but that's just because the sides get raised up.
So then you sow your seeds. So I take seeds out of the packet and put them in my hand first before I put them in the ground in case I have like a spill out of the packet or anything. But you only want to put a little bit in your hand at a time because if you put them in your hand and you get dirt on them or whatever, and then you try to put them back in, then when you try to sow them in the future, they won't germinate as well. And remember to take them out of the packet this way and not rolling over the sticky part. I still do that all the time. Okay. So you just put a little in your hand and then you just sort of sprinkle them like salt. And you want to watch carefully how many you're putting down because you want to put the right amount. You may feel with small seeds like you're not putting enough, but chances are it's plenty. You want to do a tiny bit more than you need, but if you do too many, then they'll all just end up competing with each other and you'll just have to thin all of them out. If you have a bigger seed like peas, you can just plop them in every couple inches, a little closer than you want your plants to be, just in case they don't all come up. So after you're done, then you just gently cover up your seeds with your hand. This is good with small seeds when you want to really carefully control how deep the soil is above them. Or if you're planting a whole lot and it's a little deeper, like with peas, you can use your hoe to just cover them up that way. And then you'll want to just gently press the soil down to make sure everything stays in place. And then every time you plant, you always want to water right after. So when you're watering seeds, always use the gentlest setting that you can on your hose so that you don't disturb the little seedlings. And make sure that you water every day while your seeds are germinating and when the plants are really small so that seed coat stays moist and the little seedlings don't dry out. So for individually sown seeds, you'll want to measure out exactly where you want to put them. A lot of times I'll make a line in the soil, not quite a furrow, but just to help keeping them straight. And so you'll measure where you want them to be. You can use a tape measure or it's okay just to estimate. And then you'll plant your 3 seeds all in one spot, but not exactly on top of each other. Give them like a little bit of space to breathe, but all in the place where you want your plant. Okay. And if you're going to be planting along a trellis, make sure that it's a few inches out from the trellis, and it's good to alternate sides just to keep everything balanced. So for transplanting, you're going to have these little packages, and chances are you're going to have them for at least a day or two, if not longer, before you plant them. So depending on where they came from, they may or may not be hardened off. This is the name for transitioning out of that nice warm greenhouse into the cold and windy real world. So this process involves leaving them outside for part of the day and then bringing them in until eventually you leave them outside all the time. So if you're not sure if they've been hardened off or if you transplanted them yourself at home, move them back and forth for a few days, starting in a partially sheltered area and then out into full exposure, and then let them stay outside through the night so that they can gradually build up their strength. You also want to make sure that they have plenty of water during this time. This package is a very small space and it will dry out very quickly, so the soil should always be moist. Check on them at least once a day. Since it takes them a day or two to recover, try not to transplant right before any harsh weather like a frost or a storm or a heat spell to minimize their stress. So now you're ready to transplant, and the first thing you're going to do before you even take them out of the package is to water them. And ideally you'll do this about half an hour or an hour ahead of time so they can soak up the water and help ease their transition into the ground, but at least make sure that their soil is wet through. And then when I pull the plant out of the package, I'm hoping that the roots will have developed enough so that it all comes out easily all together in a root ball. And if it hasn't, and the soil is all crumbling because the roots can't hold on to it, that may be a sign that they aren't ready to be transplanted, and you should wait until they're a little bigger. You tilt the package to the side and you gently squeeze the bottom of it and slide the plant out. You should always hold your transplants by that root ball to avoid damaging the stem or the leaves. Sometimes you will see people break up the roots of their plant before they put it in the ground. And this can be helpful if the plant is very root bound, which means you pull it out and it's all white with roots and they're going around and around in the pot looking for more nutrients. This means that it was in the pot for too long. So if you have that, breaking up the roots can be helpful so that they get the idea that they don't have to keep going in circles anymore. But unless you have really root bound seedlings, it's not necessary, and you could actually do more harm than good by damaging the roots. So how deep should you plant them? Whatever potting soil you have the transplants started in will have a different water evaporation rate than the garden soil. So you always want to cover that up to keep your roots from protected from drying out. You also want to make sure that a little bit of the stem is buried to keep it supported. So for some plants, the first two leaves, the seed leaves or cotyledons, this plant just has one left on it. They'll be yellow by now because their job was just to get the sprout out of the ground, and they've done that. So you can take those off in order to be able to plant the stem deeper. And if you have any other leaves that are yellow at the bottom, it's okay to pull those off too. But don't bury any leaves because that could open your plant up to rot. So you also never want to plant them any deeper than their growing tip. So this is the place where the new growth is coming out of. And so this will generally be at the top of your plant or in the center if the leaves go up above. So it will look like a little bud right in the very center. And so this is where all of the new leaves and the stem will grow out of and everything like that. So if it gets covered up, the plant will probably die. So you can pull off any leaves that you need to. Make sure that the potting soil is well covered up by your garden soil, and then just tuck it in so that the stem is nice and supported. And then just like with seeds, you always have to water after you transplant. This way reduces their stress. So even if it's going to rain that night, you should still water, because if the soil around the root ball is drier than the potting soil, all of the moisture will get sucked out of the soil very quickly. So you want everything to be wet. So whether you sow or transplant, it's a good practice to label your plants with a stake, especially if you have multiple varieties of something. And I have these packs of labels for you. You should also definitely be writing it down in the planner that I gave all of you. So write down the date that you planted it, the variety name, the location in the garden, and the seed company name or where the transplant came from. So you can compare with your maturity date and everything later on in the year, and you can also compare with next year and the year after. Onions in particular are an important one to keep the growing tip in mind, because it's good to plant onions deeply, but you can't really see the growing tip because it's on the inside. So you just want to make sure that you don't plant any deeper than the sort of elbows of the leaves. And the reason why you want to plant them deeply is because they won't grow downward. All it's going to do is just sort of expand. And pretty much all plants work this way too. The boundary between the stem and the roots is going to stay exactly where you plant it. And the roots will grow down and the stem will grow up from there. So it's good to have it just a little bit underground to give it some protection.
So there are a couple other plants that are a bit unique for transplanting. Potatoes are planted very deeply because compared to the size of a seed, they are gigantic. And the potatoes, the actual potatoes, grow out of that intersection between the stem and the roots of the plant, which is actually above the seed potato that you plant. So the seed potato needs to be very deep in order for the potatoes to actually stay underground while they're growing. So to plant potatoes, you'll make a furrow about 6 inches deep using your hoe, and then plant the potato with the eyes pointing up. And ours actually already have sprouts on them, so you want the sprouts pointing up. And then you cover them up very gently for the ones that have sprouts so they don't get snapped. And you can leave a little bit of a dip in your furrow for now, so instead of covering up the full 6 inches, you can cover up 4 inches and then cover them more later on. So after your potatoes have grown leaves and they've grown at least 6 inches tall, you'll mound up the soil a few inches around the stems to make sure that those growing potatoes will be covered. So then you can also do this a second time once the leaves have grown at least 6 more inches, and just keep mounding up the soil from around the plants. And you can remove the leaves or not when you do this, but you'll want to remove any lower leaves that have turned yellow or have any brown spots because they could have developed diseases. If you still have potatoes very close to the surface after hilling them up twice and you've run out of soil around them, try covering them up with compost or with straw to keep the potatoes from getting exposed and turning green. So like I mentioned, tomatoes are one of those plants that will grow roots all along the stem if you plant it underground. So a lot of people will try to get their tomatoes as tall as possible before planting and then bury it all the way to the tip. I don't really think there's much benefit to going that extreme with it. It could potentially stress out or confuse your plant if it's 3 feet tall and then suddenly underground. But overall, this is an effective method. They've got the right idea. So you'll dig a much deeper hole for your tomatoes than you would for other transplants. I recommend deciding on how deep to plant by looking at the tomato plant. So if it has lots of strong, healthy leaves already, there's no point in burying those because that's not really helping the plant. But if the bottom part of the stem is pretty long with just a couple of leaves, it's definitely worth trimming those leaves off and planting it up to the next set of leaves. So measure the hole based on that depth and make sure the soil is loose even deeper down than that because tomatoes are very deep rooters. If you have a super tall plant, like if you're going to be digging a hole more than a foot deep, you can dig a trench at an angle around like 6 inches deep and lay the plant on its side. But just make sure that the top will end up in the right place for your trellis, and just remember where the bottom is so that you can give the roots plenty of water. So using this method, you'll end up with the lowest set of leaves pretty close to the surface of the soil, maybe 3 inches away. But as they grow, as soon as the tomato is strong enough to handle it, trim off those lowest leaves so there isn't any foliage within 6 inches of the soil level. This will help prevent disease, which I'll talk a little bit about later on. So when you water, whether you're using a watering can or a hose, you want to aim at the ground. Watering the leaves doesn't really have any benefits, and it can actually do some damage. So water around the base of the plant where the roots are. You don't need to water the entire bed if your plants aren't covering the entire bed, but you do need to make sure that you put plenty near the roots because the dry soil around the wet soil will suck some of the water away. Always keep the hose moving as you water. Don't let it sit in one spot or it'll start pushing the soil around and pooling up. I use a steady pattern. I go over each spot a few times, so I'll pass over, let the water soak in, water the next one while I wait, do another pass, and repeat. Generally, if your soil is draining really fast, that means you need to put more water down. If you find that it's not draining at all and it's just flooding the surface, that could be a sign that your soil needs to be loosened up. You'll notice here that the water is pooling very quickly. I just worked up the soil, so I know it's soft enough, which means that it's actually caused by my watering can. The holes are too big and it's putting out too much water at once. So if you can help it, don't be like me and put down water very slowly and gently so that it doesn't flood, because that can be a major cause of compaction. Water will evaporate from the surface of the soil quickly, but deep down it'll stay stored for longer. So when you have a seed or a small seedling, they will need water often, like every day, because they're stuck up near the surface. Larger plants with deeper roots can tap into that stored water deeper down, so they can be watered less often, just a couple times a week, but you need to make sure that you're putting down more water so that it's able to reach those deep roots. So that means that it's important to notice the soil moisture at the depth that you're aiming for. You can check your soil moisture by sticking your hand down into the soil at least 4 or 5 inches to see how the soil feels. If it's cool and damp, you may not need to water. If it feels warm and dry, it's definitely time. Most plants will want roughly 1 inch of water per week, whether that's from rain or a hose, and it's generally better if it's split up over 2 or more sessions during the week. If you can't get a good sense of how much water you're putting down, you can try putting a container with straight sides in the area that you're watering, and then measure how deep the water is when you're done. I don't recommend doing this all the time, just maybe a couple times to get a sense of how much water you're using if you don't feel sure. One thing I do not recommend is to make a watering schedule. With the amount of rain that we get in this region, you won't need to water nearly as much as you probably think. At the community garden, I really only use the irrigation system if it doesn't rain for a full week, which hardly ever happens. You should, however, be checking if you need to water on a regular basis. So check your soil moisture and then water if it feels dry, but don't just water because it's Tuesday, How often you need to water and how much you need to water will change based on the season, the weather, the cloud cover, the size of your crops, so there's no prescription that you can follow. Basically, if your soil feels a little bit dry, water it a little bit. If it feels very dry, water it more. You can also look at the forecast when you're deciding to water. If your plants are getting dry but it's going to rain tomorrow, you might want to skip it so your plants don't get overly wet. But I will say that summertime showers aren't always actually very much rain, and it might not be enough to count for a full watering session. So it's just generally a good habit to check your soil moisture every day while you're out there. Another thing about rain is that over time it will actually compact your soil from the force of all those tiny little punches of the drops. So if you notice a crust forming or cracking on the surface of your soil, you can just freshen it up with a rake to keep it draining properly. It's normal for your plants to droop a tiny bit on hot, sunny days, but if it's really noticeable, make sure to give them some water to cool the soil and keep them from losing too much moisture. And there's nothing really wrong with watering on a hot, sunny day if that's the only time you have, but it will be less effective than if you water in the early morning or in the evening so it doesn't all just evaporate away. Okay, I want to talk about hoses for a moment. Of course, this is a very common annoyance, kinks in your hose. Once you have a spot on your hose that gets a kink in it over and over, it won't go away and eventually it will crack your hose. So the best thing to do is try to avoid that in the first place. When you're moving the hose, try to allow it to twist and untwist in your hands rather than just yanking it. It's a little bit slower, but not as slow as walking back and forth to pull all the kinks out. Most hose issues can be linked back to the way that the hose has been stored. If you always store your hose properly after you use it, it will serve you much longer. One method you can try for coiling your hose is a figure 8 pattern. You just draw an 8 with the hose and then trace it over and over. You can also use this concept to make a round coil by crossing the loops over and under. If you have a new hose and you want to break it in to be able to try this, lay it out as straight as you can and let the sun warm it up before you try to reshape it. When you're not using the hose, drain it out and store it out of the sun to keep it from cracking. During the winter, it should definitely be indoors in a garage or a shed. It's definitely worth taking good care of your hoses to save some annoyance and make it last longer.
So after your sprouts have come up, it's time to thin them. So thinning is when you remove some of your seedlings to make room for the others, and this is an important part of the process. When you sow seeds outside, not all of them will germinate well, so you'll want to sow more seeds than you actually need. And then once you see what comes up, then you can remove the extra plants. So you can do this by pulling the whole plant out, or if it might disturb the one next to it, just pinch it off at ground level. And it does feel pretty sad to thin out your beautiful little seedlings, but remember that the difference between thinning and not thinning is 1 foot of 6 or 7 really big, beautiful carrots, or 20 or 30 spindly little things that never get the chance to grow up. So you'll need to thin just about everything. You can get away with not thinning some of your leafy greens or some of your herbs, but all of your seedlings will benefit from thinning. And there are 2 formats for thinning. For the plants on your crop list that were by the row foot, you'll thin them all along the length of the line so that they're spaced on the row spacing that's listed on your chart. For the crops that are listed by the exact number of plants, you plant 3 seeds in that hole, and then you will thin those 3 seedlings down to 1. You'll want to do this maybe a week or 2 after your plants have sprouted. I wait until the plants start to have true leaves, which are the leaves that come after the first 2 out of the ground. That way you can tell which plants are the strongest and growing the best. You don't want to wait too long though, because the longer your plants are crammed together, the more they'll compete with each other and the more they'll struggle.
The way you choose which seedlings to thin can be based on a few things. The first is plant strength. When you're thinning, you always want to keep the seedlings that look the healthiest, the ones that are bigger, stronger, and farther along in their growth than the others. So you can compare the number of leaves between plants, look for any discoloration or misshapen leaves, or if one is clearly stretched out and likely to flop over without the other next to it. And this is one thing to note. Just because it's taller doesn't mean that it's better. You have to make sure that it looks strong and sturdy compared to the one next to it. The next is spacing. This is the most important for plants that are very close together, like carrots or beets. Each plant needs to have enough space to grow up to its full size without bumping into the next one. So start by finding a strong looking sprout and then thin the others that are right around it. For plants that are a bit farther apart, like beans or peas, spacing is important, but it doesn't have to be perfect. So, if it's supposed to be 4 inches and there's a couple that are at 3 or a couple that are at 5, it'll be close enough. It's just one of the tools that you can use for deciding. One last thing to consider is location. On the one hand, you might choose plants in a way that gives you a straight line, so you don't have to go around them when you're hoeing. But on the other hand, you can use sideways spacing to your advantage and fit a few more plants in than you could if they were all in a perfect line. Depends on the crop. Don't think too hard when you're thinning though. It should be a pretty quick process. Also, sometimes if I feel like it's just too much and I must be destroying my crop, I'll go through and thin once and then I'll come back later and then I'll see a lot more that I can still thin out. So remember to keep the thinning process in mind as you sow your seeds, and sow a little bit more than you need, but not too much more, or that's just more that you'll have to thin out. So hoeing is something that you should start thinking about pretty much right after you plant. When your soil is exposed and getting water, weeds will grow. So do not wait to start getting rid of the weeds until they've grown big enough to look like a problem. You should be hoeing them when you can barely even see them at all. By far, the easiest time to get rid of weeds is right after they've sprouted, when they haven't really grown any leaves or roots. It's easier to kill them when they're this small, and it's also a lot easier on you to just glide the hoe over them and not really have to fight with them. If you hoe them while they're at this thread stage, when the root is just like a thread, it will only take you a few minutes compared to potentially a couple hours to pull all of those weeds once they've grown up. And we all know that the longer something's going to take, the more we end up putting it off, and it's a vicious cycle. So just do it on time. You can generally plan to hoe about 2 weeks after planting, and then again about 2 weeks later. And then after that, it just depends on how many weed seeds you have in your soil. But you should always be on the lookout for baby weeds while you're out in the garden, because I promise you, hoeing early is way less time consuming and way less painful on your back than waiting too long. So when you hoe, the goal is to just scrape just underneath the surface of the soil, so you can cut the weeds at that point where the stem meets the roots, because that's the surest way to kill it. If the whole thing comes up with the roots, that works too, as long as it's not really wet, in which case it could actually re-root. So the best time to hoe is on a dry, sunny day, because the plants will wilt and die right away. If you can't do it on a sunny day, that's fine, but always try to hoe when it's dry, because if it's too wet, the weeds won't come up easily. You'll sort of just push them around without cutting them, and then they may still re-root anyway. You can walk forward or backward as you hoe. I usually just walk forward, but some people prefer backward. Either way, you need to hoe in a steady pattern and push the weeds and the dirt into the area that you've already hoed, so that you don't accidentally cover up any weeds that you haven't gotten to yet. Hoe as close to your crops as you feel comfortable about not hitting them, and then you can go back later and pull whatever weeds are left right up close. And you don't have to pick up the weeds after you've hoed them, especially if the weather is dry, but if it's going to rain or they're just particularly large, you can rake them away and compost them. But hopefully they will never get to be large if you keep hoeing the weeds whenever you see them pop up. Try to hoe them before they even get 2 or 3 inches tall, because you will save yourself a ton of time and effort. So now you have my 2 biggest gardening lessons for this whole program, and 2 of the most common mistakes that people make. Don't compress your soil, and hoe your weeds as early and as often as you can, and this will make your gardening season so much easier. Alright, now let's talk about mulch. Mulch is just stuff you put on top of your soil. There are many different kinds of mulch. It can be wood chips, it could be straw, plastic sheeting, leaves, gravel, bark, anything that you can lay on top of your soil. So there are organic mulches from living things and inorganic mulches like plastic and rocks. All of those are mulch. And there are 2 separate ways that you can mulch your vegetable garden. You can mulch your paths, or you can mulch your garden beds right around your plants. Or both, obviously. If you mulch your paths, the main benefit is weed suppression. It's one less area of your garden you have to worry about. It also keeps your shoes cleaner, and it can give your garden a sort of organized look. Mulching your garden beds also helps with weeds, but it has a number of other benefits too. It works as insulation for your soil, which means that it stays cooler in summer and warmer in winter. If you use an organic mulch, it can also act as a slow-release fertilizer as it gradually decomposes. Mulch can also act as a cushion against compaction, especially from heavy rain. And rain can also splash dirt up onto your crops, which is annoying, but for some crops, tomatoes in particular, it can contribute to the spread of disease. Tomatoes are very susceptible to disease, many of which live in the soil. So put mulch down at the base of the plants and make sure that the leaves aren't within 6 inches of the ground to help prevent any soil-borne diseases from splashing up onto the tomato plant. Mulch also helps retain moisture in the soil, which can be great, but if it's a particularly wet season, you may want to consider just a very thin layer of mulch, enough to cushion against compaction, but not enough to keep your soil wet all the time. So when you're putting down mulch, generally you should add about 2 to 3 inches of the mulch. Less than that, it won't be as effective, and any more could potentially change the soil environment underneath. You should also try to keep the mulch at least an inch or two away from the stems of any plants to prevent any possible burns or rot as it decomposes. And then water the mulch right after you put it down to help hold it in place. At the end of the year, depending on your type of mulch and the state that it's in, you can rake it off and compost it, or you can leave it where it is and either work it into your soil or just layer on top of it next year. Mulch is a great way to manage weeds in your garden, but keep in mind that some weeds will still come up through the mulch, but you'll no longer be able to hoe, so you'll have to pull the weeds by hand. On a small scale, it's definitely worth it, but the larger your garden is, the less practical it may be. If you don't want to mulch your whole garden, you can choose crop by crop. Like lower maintenance crops like peppers would probably be better to mulch than a crop you'll be handling often, like carrots. You can also mulch at different times during the season, like you'll probably want to mulch your tomatoes right away, but you may want to hoe your onions once or twice and then mulch them a little later. I want to run through some common types of mulch, starting with mulches for your beds and then for your pads. The best mulches for vegetable beds are lightweight organic materials that you can find around your yard or your neighborhood and will decompose gradually over the course of the year without disturbing your crops. Grass clippings are a great option because a lot of people have these freely available, but make sure that you let them dry out before you use them or they could decompose way too quickly and cook your crops. You should also make sure that you don't use clippings from a lawn that has been treated with any chemicals. Fallen leaves are another good free option. You can just rake them up and stick them in your garden, but they will do better if they've been chopped up a little bit, like by a mower, or if they've been allowed to decompose a little bit at first. Then they'll be less likely to plate together and stick together or to blow all around your garden. Straw. This is a good, easily accessible option. It's pretty lightweight and it compacts down pretty quickly, so it may need multiple applications over the year. It's also worth mentioning that straw is different from hay. Hay still has the seeds on it, which means that it's not a very good mulch because those seeds will sprout. Straw will still have some seeds in it, so you can expect a few seedlings, but it's few enough that usually you can just stir your mulch around and flip it over and that will kill the sprouts. Pine needles. Some people say that these make your soil more acidic, but that's only true if you're mixing like a whole lot of chopped up pine needles into your soil. If you just lay them on top, there shouldn't be a noticeable pH difference. So this is another good option if you happen to have a lot of them. Compost. There are better uses for compost, but in a pinch, it can be used for mulch. If you use a commercial compost that's been sterilized, it will help suppress weeds, and it will also have nutritional benefits for your soil, but not as much as if you mixed it in. Newspaper and cardboard. These are best used underneath another mulch to help hold it down, but they do have great weed suppression and they will break down slowly over time. So if you use cardboard, make sure that it has any tape removed, and for paper, don't use anything glossy or printed with a lot of colors, as it could potentially leach chemicals into your soil. Then you have mulches that work well for paths. These give more heavy-duty weed control, but are less practical for vegetable beds. You can use bed mulches in your paths, but using path mulches in your beds just gets more complicated. Black plastic is just a sheet of plastic and it gives very strong weed control, but it doesn't allow water through and it can gradually cause compaction and cut off airflow, which makes it not ideal for vegetable beds. It comes in a lot of different thicknesses, so some people do use the thinner plastics as a bed mulch, and you can do this, but I don't really think it's worth the time or the effort for a small home garden. But you could use a thicker black plastic to line your paths to keep weeds from growing there. Black plastic can be used as a bottom layer for your path with more mulch on top of it, but I would really only recommend adding wood chips because things like straw and leaves can get very slippery on it. Landscape fabric is pretty similar to black plastic, but it does allow some air and water to flow through for the soil underneath. It's usually more expensive than black plastic, but it lasts a long time. Wood chips can be a great option for your paths because they break down slowly and do a good job of weed control. They're also a habitat for mycorrhiza, the good fungus. However, they can be pokey for kneeling on, and they're not ideal for mixing into your beds because they break down slowly and can lock up nutrients. Bark is an alternative to wood chips. They have a more uniform size, which is nice for walking or kneeling on, but if your garden has a slope, they may wash downhill more easily. It's also something you would probably end up having to purchase by the bag, which would get expensive. I don't recommend using any dyed mulches if you're going to buy mulch because it's questionable where that wood may have come from, where the dye may have come from, and whether it's actually safe to use near your food crops. Wood chips from an arborist are generally a better bet and a safer bet than purchased dyed mulches. So that's a lot of options, and there are even more. So you can pick whatever is right for you and your garden, and you can play around with different types to see what works the best. But generally, I would just suggest that you choose whatever is freely available around you because there are so many options. There's usually no need to go buy an expensive mulch.
All right, so there you have it. So as soon as we can finish tilling, you'll be all set to get started. And then we'll talk about next steps in next month's class, stuff like trellising and composting. But until then, just let me know if you have any questions about any of this. And as always, I'll be available for guidance all along the way.